At 8 a.m. on June 5, 1938, the earth itself was turned into a weapon. The banks of the Yellow River were deliberately broken. And within hours, an ocean of water rushed across villages, fields, and sleeping towns. A shocking question rises from this moment in history. How can a river become more deadly than bombs? Families awoke to the sound of roaring water instead of sirens. Farmers dropped their tools and ran toward higher ground. Mothers lifted children onto rooftops while walls collapsed beneath them. The river did not choose soldiers or civilians. It swallowed everything in its path: homes, crops, animals, and human lives. One survivor later whispered, "The river came like a black wall, and we had nowhere to go." The flood spread across 3 provinces. Roads vanished. Trains stopped. Entire communities disappeared from maps. People clung to trees and floating doors, praying that the current would spare them. Some walked for days without food or water, carrying only the memory of what their villages had once been. This was not a natural disaster. It was a human decision made in the shadow of war. The intention was to slow an advancing army, but the cost was paid by civilians who had no voice in that choice. History recorded the flood as a military tactic, yet for millions, it was the beginning of hunger, exile, and grief. Children were separated from parents. Elders were left behind in rising waters. The sound of rushing currents replaced the sound of daily life. Crops were destroyed just before harvest season, ensuring that even survivors would face famine. Disease followed the flood, carried by polluted water and crowded refugee camps. No battlefield saw this tragedy. No single explosion marked its beginning. Instead, a quiet order was given, and a river answered with unstoppable force. The Yellow River, known for centuries as both a giver and taker of life, became a symbol of how war can turn nature into a tool of destruction. The most haunting part of this story is not only how many died, but how many lived without homes, wandering from village to village, with no future in sight. The flood did not end in one day. Its consequences lasted for years, reshaping the land and the people who depended on it. To understand how such a decision was made and why millions of civilians paid the price, we must look back at the war that pushed leaders toward this desperate act, which brings us directly into the historical background of the Yellow River flood. By 1938, the war in China had reached a critical stage. Japanese forces were advancing rapidly through northern and central regions. Major cities had already fallen, and transportation routes were under threat. The Yellow River stood between the advancing army and the interior of the country. The river had always been unpredictable. For thousands of years, floods had shaped Chinese history. Engineers built dikes and channels to control it, knowing that failure would bring catastrophe. In wartime, these same structures became points of strategic importance as military pressure increased. Leaders faced a desperate dilemma. Conventional defenses were failing. Air raids and artillery had weakened cities. The idea emerged to use the river itself as a barrier. By destroying the dikes near Huangpu, in Hunan province, water would flood the plains and block advancing forces. This decision was made under extreme conditions. Communication systems were limited. Evacuation plans were incomplete. Many villages received no warning at all. When the dikes were breached, the water rushed outward with enormous force, spreading across farmland and into populated regions. The flood changed the geography of eastern China. Rivers shifted course. Fields became lakes. Transportation collapsed. Refugees fled toward higher ground, often without food or shelter. Local governments struggled to respond as disease and famine followed the destruction. Technology played a tragic role. Explosives and tools were used to open the riverbanks. What had once been protective engineering became an instrument of disaster. The same river that supported agriculture now erased it. International observers later described the flood as one of the largest acts of environmental warfare in modern history. It demonstrated how war had moved beyond battlefields and into the lives of civilians. The flood did not only slow armies, it reshaped society itself. The suffering was not limited to one moment. Years after the water receded, the land remained damaged. Crops failed. Families remained displaced. Entire generations grew up in refugee camps or temporary settlements. The importance of the Yellow River flood lies in what it revealed about modern war. It showed that survival was no longer tied only to soldiers and weapons, but to decisions that affected millions of innocent people. Nature itself could be turned into a weapon, and civilians would bear the consequences. This event became a symbol of how war transforms landscapes and human lives at the same time. It is remembered not for victory or defeat, but for loss and endurance, from this background of fear, urgency, and irreversible choice. The full story of civilian suffering and survival during the Yellow River flood begins, leading directly into the main events that unfolded. When water replaced roads and rivers replaced borders. At 6:30 a.m. on June 5, 1938, engineers arrived at the dikes near Huiwanku, carrying tools and explosives instead of food or medicine. The air was heavy with dust and fear, and villagers watched from a distance, unsure of what was about to happen. Orders were brief and final, and the river waited in silence. When the first section of the dike collapsed, water burst forward like a living creature released from chains. Within minutes, muddy waves raced across the plains, faster than horses and louder than artillery. Fields that had taken years to cultivate vanished under brown currents. Paths that once led to markets turned into rivers without direction. In nearby villages, people were eating breakfast when the water arrived. Pots were dropped, doors were torn away, and walls cracked as if made of paper. Some families climbed onto rooftops, holding each other while the current pulled at the foundations beneath them. Others ran toward higher ground, but the land was flat, and the water rose faster than human legs could carry them. One farmer later recalled, "I saw my neighbor lift his child onto a tree, and the next moment, the tree was gone." His words were not recorded as a speech or a report, but as a memory passed from one survivor to another. Refugees moved in every direction. Ox carts carried the injured. Mothers carried infants. Children carried nothing but fear. There were no maps for escape, only instinct and hope. Roads disappeared underwater, and trains stopped where tracks ended in floods. As the water spread across Hunan, Anhui, and Jiangsu provinces, it brought more than destruction. Wells became polluted. Dead animals floated beside broken furniture. Disease followed the flood like a second wave. Camps formed on higher ground, where thousands gathered with little food and no shelter. Military observers watched from distant positions. Their goal had been to slow the advancing army, and for a time, the flood did block movement. Vehicles could not cross. Supplies could not travel. The river became a wall of mud and sorrow. But the price was measured not in days of delay, but in human lives. Technology had turned against the people it once protected. The dikes, built to guard villages from nature, had become weapons against civilians. Explosives replaced bricks. Strategy replaced safety. The flood showed how modern war no longer needed bombs to destroy cities. It could simply open a gate and let nature finish the task. Communication failed almost completely. Some villages never heard a warning. Others received messages too late. Bells rang, but the water rang louder. By the time people understood what was happening, the flood had already claimed its path. The story of survival spread in fragments. A woman who floated 4 hours on a door. A boy who lost his parents, but found strangers who became family. An old man who refused to leave his house and disappeared with it. These were not legends, but quiet tragedies recorded in refugee lists and relief reports. Relief efforts were slow and limited. Food shortages grew worse, as farmland remained underwater. Hunger replaced fear. Disease replaced hunger. Entire communities were forced to rebuild from nothing. Some never returned to their original homes, because their homes no longer existed. The river did not stop after one day. It continued to reshape the land for months. Channels shifted. New lakes formed. Old villages became memories. The flood did what armies could not. It erased borders between land and water. International journalists later described the scene as a disaster without a battlefield. There were no trenches, only currents. No gunfire, only cries. The victims were not soldiers, but families who had never carried weapons. This was the heart of the tragedy. The decision was meant to protect territory, but it transformed civilians into casualties of strategy. The war entered kitchens and fields, not just cities and fronts. By the time the water slowed, millions were displaced. The flood had succeeded in changing the course of military movement, but it had also changed the course of human lives. The Yellow River had become a witness to suffering, carrying stories in its muddy flow. From this unfolding disaster arose a moment when the full meaning of the flood became clear, not through military reports, but through the silent question left behind. What had truly been gained, and what had been lost forever, leading directly into the climax of this tragic chapter. The Yellow River flood did not arrive with an explosion or a single battle. It arrived in the stillness after the water had taken everything it could. Villages stood half submerged. Roofs looked like islands. Smoke rose from makeshift fires on high ground, where survivors gathered in silence. The advancing forces were slowed, but the human cost was impossible to ignore. The land that had once fed millions now produced nothing. The delay gained by the flood was measured in weeks, while the suffering it created lasted 4 years. Officials began to understand that the river could not be controlled once it was released. The flood spread beyond its intended boundaries. Nature followed no orders. It carved new channels and destroyed old plans. What had been imagined as a temporary barrier became a permanent scar. In refugee camps, the reality of loss settled in. People searched for missing relatives. Names were called into empty air. Children waited for parents who would never return. Elders stared at the horizon where their villages once stood. One relief worker wrote, "We did not hear gunshots, but we saw a battlefield of water." His words captured the moment when strategy met consequence. Disease became the next enemy. Contaminated water led to outbreaks of illness. Hunger weakened bodies. Medical supplies were scarce. The flood had not only drowned the land, it had drowned hope. Yet within this darkness, acts of humanity appeared. Strangers shared food. Families adopted orphaned children. Villagers rebuilt shelters from mud and wood. Survival became a quiet form of resistance, not against an army, but against despair. The lesson of the flood slowly emerged. War had forced leaders to choose between losing ground and losing lives. The river had delayed military movement, but it had also revealed the limits of such decisions. The environment could be used as a weapon, but it could not be aimed precisely. Civilians would always stand in its path. Years later, historians would debate whether the flood achieved its intended purpose. Some would say it bought time. Others would say it destroyed more than it protected. What could not be debated was the suffering of the displaced. The resolution of this story lies not in victory or defeat, but in memory. The Yellow River flood became a symbol of how far war can reach into ordinary life. It showed that survival sometimes comes with unbearable cost. When the waters finally receded, the land was changed forever. New river paths remained. Old towns were never rebuilt. The scars of the flood stayed visible in fields and in families. The people who lived through it carried the weight of a decision they did not make. Their lives became part of history without their consent. They did not fight in battles, yet they endured one of the largest human disasters of the war. The flood taught a lesson written not in speeches, but in mud and silence. It showed that desperation can turn nature into a weapon, and that civilians will always pay the highest price. What was learned was not how to use rivers in war, but how fragile human safety becomes when strategy overrides compassion. The Yellow River did not choose sides. It followed gravity and took everything in its path. The climax passed when the water stopped rising. The resolution began when survivors stood up and walked forward, carrying loss instead of weapons. Their endurance became the true ending of this chapter. This story does not close with triumph. It closes with reflection on what war can demand from those who never chose to fight. The flood remains a warning from history that even decisions made in fear can create suffering beyond imagination. And from this moment of understanding, the story moves toward its final reflection, where memory becomes the last voice of those who were carried away by the river. The Yellow River flood of 1938 did not end with silence. It ended with memory. Long after the water withdrew, the suffering remained written into the land and into the people who survived. Fields that once fed families became empty plains of mud. Villages that once echoed with voices became places of absence. History often remembers battles and generals, but this chapter was shaped by civilians who never chose to stand on any front line. This tragedy reminds us that war does not only destroy armies, it reshapes everyday life. Children learned fear before they learned peace. Parents learned loss before they learned safety. The river became a witness to pain that had no uniform and no nationality. It carried homes, crops, and human dreams into the sea, leaving behind questions that still have no easy answers. What makes this story endure is not strategy, but survival. People rebuilt shelters with broken wood. Families searched for one another across flooded lands. Strangers shared food when nothing was certain. In those moments, humanity resisted despair without weapons, without slogans, only with endurance. The flood teaches a lesson about the limits of control. Nature cannot be commanded by fear or force. Once released, it follows only its own path. The civilians who suffered were not part of any military decision, yet they paid the highest price. Their experience stands as a warning to every generation that war always reaches beyond soldiers and leaders and enters the lives of the innocent. Today, the Yellow River still flows, calm on the surface, but heavy with history. Beneath its waters lie stories of families who vanished and communities that never returned. Remembering them is not about blame and not about praise. It is about understanding the cost of choices made in desperation. This story survives so that future generations may listen, not to glorify suffering, but to recognize it. Not to repeat it, but to learn from it. The river's lesson is simple and painful. When war uses nature as a weapon, humanity becomes the battlefield. I've just said what's recorded in history. You should find out the real truth yourself. We have written the sources from which we got this story in the description of this video, and we have always been and will be supporters of the oppressed, regardless of their color, race, or country. This world and its creator are also with the oppressed. If this World War II story moved you, like this video, comment your thoughts below and share it so others remember these forgotten tragedies. Subscribe for more real World War II stories of civilians and survival. History must be remembered, not repeated. See you in the next World War II story.